All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast Week 5 edition. Crazy. The season is flying by, already 4 weeks under the belt. I'm Brian Jester, co host, co founder here at Occupy Fantasy, joined as always by our NFL writer, Chris Rooney. What's happening, Chris?
Ryan, happy to be here again. Looking forward to talking about week 5 with you.
Hell yeah. So, just a quick reminder before we do get started, our lineup builder is ready to use. It's been ready to use all NFL season. So, if you've been living under a rock, here's another announcement for you. OccupyFantasy.com/lineup builder is where you can build up to 150 lineups. Use our optimal lineup criteria to build just a handful of lineups if you want to. One of our members, Swag Ken, took down the FanDuel single game GPP for $48,000 last week. So he used the lineup builder as well. Again, OccupyFantasy.com/lineup builder is where you can get access to that. Chris, before we jump into any news, notes, look ahead, we have once again some COVID related potential post moments this week. What are we looking at?
Well, so everybody at this point knows, obviously, the Tennessee Titans did not play in week 4 due to a little bit of an outbreak, I guess, of coronavirus with the organization. And it was looking like they might be able to get back to work this week. But here on Wednesday morning, they did have a couple more positive tests, which has set their timeline back for their game against the Bills on Sunday. Um, just because this is a DFS show, really our only concern is whether or not the game will be on the slate on Sunday. I'm starting to feel like that game probably won't be. The Patriots also announced that Stephon Gilmore, their star cornerback, tested positive for the coronavirus on Tuesday evening. So still at this time, sounds like the Broncos Patriots game is being planned to go ahead, but with each of these games, that would be Denver, New England, and Tennessee, Buffalo. Just monitor the news up until Sunday, everyone, because there's no guarantee these games or really any other game is actually going to happen as long as we get these negative tests. If we don't get negative tests, I should say.
Yeah, and Oakland and Kansas City too. Kansas City played New England Monday night, and Oakland has already had one or two positive tests this week. They announced another one this morning, so a third game to keep an eye on. As usual, we're being flexible with our monitoring of news up until lock, just even more so this year. So, Chris, let's talk about what's been happening on the field. So, we like to start these episodes with a review of the previous week for the injuries and situation changes that will impact our following week's DFS lineups. So, week 4. A couple big injuries to running backs: Nick Chubb, Austin Eckler. Nick Chubb's out for a while. It looks like probably 5 to 6 weeks with that MCL sprain. We got Kareem Hunt, Dearness Johnson got some run, and even Dontrell Hilliard in a game where they ran for about 7,000 yards against the Cowboys.
Absolutely unbelievably pathetic performance on defense by the Cowboys yet again. Yeah, it's too bad. I think Chubb was going to make us very happy tournament players if we had him in our lineups the way that game was trending.
Yep.
So it does to me look like Kareem Hunt is probably the guy. He let's not forget that he went into the game with the Cowboys, Brian, with a groin injury, right? So I do think the reason that we saw so much from Johnson and Hilliard was because I think Cleveland was still being cautious there. I still think there's some appeal to those guys behind Hunt, but my suspicion is if Hunt is actually fully healthy, he'll be the one that plays most of the time for the Browns. I think these guys behind Hunt are not like Hunt being behind Chubb, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and let's not forget, Kareem Hunt was literally the running back one for a time in Kansas City, and he's a fantastic running back. Should get a ton of work here, and should be underpriced, honestly, for what his role should be in Week 5. And then Austin Eckler, a pretty severe hamstring injury. He's been placed on injured reserve, out for a few weeks at least. The rookie Joshua Kelly will get some work, but we also can't forget about Justin Jackson. This is going to remain a split backfield.
I think so. The Chargers really like Justin Jackson. That's why they've kept him around for so long. I feel like it's been like at least 3 years now he's been kicking around on their roster. So I would expect them to use him and to continue to use Joshua Kelly. I mean, they were already sort of using both Kelly and Eckler in complementary fashion, at least earlier in the season. So maybe we see them go back to that here with Kelly and Jackson.
Yeah, and your Patriots got some running back carousel continuing. Sonny Michel actually placed on injured reserve. There was some negative vibes coming out of New England as far as Michel's availability for Monday night. Has a thigh injury, placed on injured reserve, likely going to be out at least 3 weeks. And Damian Harris was activated off injured reserve and slid basically right into the Sonny Michel role. 17 early down carries, looked good doing it, 100 yards in the process. Assuming New England plays this week, what's your New England take on this running back backfield?
I think Harris is probably the one that we want for, obviously north-south running between the tackles. Rex Burkhead still got a decent amount of play on third down situations, is what at least I recall from watching it. He had 11 carries himself and a target. So, and obviously James White's return after his kind of family tragedy there. I mean, he's kind of went back into the typical role we expect from him, being super involved in the passing game. So, New England's backfield's always messy, but it does feel like if they do play Denver here, that I think one of the early lines I saw was Patriots by 11, which might not actually be fair given the quarterback play they had against the Chiefs. But assuming that does play out, I mean, Harris might be someone we want to look at here going against the Broncos here in Week 5.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Arizona. Kenyon Drake, just massive disappointment so far, and whether it's scheme, ability, his lack of a recovery from a preseason foot injury, who knows? But he's been completely ineffective. It looked like he got hurt at the end of that game, but you and I were talking. It sounds like he just got the wind knocked out of himself in Week 4.
Yeah, exactly. I think regardless of any potential injury situation, the usage is not great. He has 5 targets in 4 games. That's disgusting. Chase Edmonds has looked really, really good in very limited work spelling Drake, and I have to start to question here, Brian, whether or not Drake's actually going to remain ahead of him. That's how ugly Drake has been to start the season here.
Yeah. So as we say that, watch Drake for explode for 30 fantasy points on
Yeah,
Sunday because that's
exactly.
how these things work. Let's talk about San Francisco. Debo activated off injured reserve. We were expecting to get him early in the season, but a little bit of a setback with his foot. But he came back, didn't have his usual role, to the dismay of everyone who played him at $200 in the DraftKings Showdown slate Sunday night. But he's back, and I imagine his workload is going to start to ramp up this week.
Yeah, he only ran a route on 32% of the dropbacks for the quarterbacks for the 49ers on Sunday Night Football. So I would expect that to increase. They just want to make sure that he's kind of playing his way back into shape here. And honestly, with how well someone like Brandon Ayuk has looked, Brian, I mean, it's made it pretty easy for them to take it easy with Debo. So, once they get both those guys going 100% and get their quarterback back, this team's going to be pretty scary.
Yeah, dude, they're loaded, and the offensive scheme obviously great. The fact that they released Mohamed Sanu this week is probably an indicator to us that Debo is ready for a much bigger workload in Week 5. The Falcons receiving core dealing with some injuries. Calvin Ridley obviously was questionable heading into Monday night. Julio super questionable heading into Monday night. Julio looks like he re-aggravated his hamstring injury. Most re-aggravations are typically a higher grade than the initial injury, or at least knock you out for a little bit longer. So I can't imagine we see Julio at least for a week or two. But there's still a pass-heavy team that's running a ton of 3 wide receiver sets.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the Wizard of Oz here, that would be Olamide Zacchaeus. I don't know if I'm saying that right, so I'm just going to continue to call him the Wizard of Oz. It's probably going to get a lot more run here. He's actually run a route on more than 75% of Ryan's dropbacks the last 2 weeks. So that would include the Week 3 game, obviously, where Julio didn't play whatsoever and Russell Gage was injured. So it looks like he's kind of creeped into these 3 wide receiver sets for the Falcons. Very pass-heavy offense with Ryan. He's an interesting value play for sure.
Yeah, if you played NFL preseason, that name will sound very familiar to you. And then a couple quarterback injuries that, or at least benchings that we should talk about really quickly. Sam Darnold hurt his shoulder, fine enough to come back in the game, but Jets think it's too much risk to play him 12 days later. So Sam Darnold's not going to play this week. Joe Flacco's going to get the start. Arizona's defense should have about, I don't know, 20, 25 sacks. And then Dwayne Haskins in Washington has been benched, relegated off the team. Didn't even take a practice snap on Wednesday. Kyle Allen, Ron Rivera favorite, will get the start this week. I know he was the guy you were at least eyeing early on once we got this news, just based on his price for DFS.
Yeah, so with these 2 backups starting this week, just as far as DFS is concerned, Kyle Allen is far more affordable on both sites this week than Flacco. 4,100. Actually, he's the same price as Flacco on FanDuel, but he's 4,100 on DraftKings versus 48 on DraftKings. So I do think a lot of people like to pay down at quarterback, especially in low risk contests on DraftKings. I think Kyle Allen is probably the better play than Flacco here, but we'll wait until Friday when we get the daily plug out to really tell you what we think here about that.
Nice little tease there. I like it. All
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
let's talk about 3 backfield situations where the usage was surprising to most in Week 4. So Jonathan Taylor, everyone expected him once Marlon Mack went down to just completely take over and be the lead back, dominate the touches. Now he got 18 touches, and in a vacuum, that looks pretty good in Week 4. But then when you look and see Naeem Hines had 12 touches, Jordan Wilkins had 10 touches against the Bears. Not getting this 70, 80% of the work like we expected. What's going on here?
No, and I mean, this is a game where the final score was misleading too. I mean, the Colts pretty much dominated this game against the Bears for 4 quarters, and there was a garbage time touchdown by the Bears to tighten it up. So the fact that Taylor didn't get the majority, well, he did get the majority, but the fact that he didn't get more touches than those other two guys in a pretty run-heavy game script is concerning. I mean, you're not going to get a much better script than that, frankly, for a running back to hit value in DFS, right? So I think we still like Jonathan Taylor as a player, but the fact that Frank Reich is kind of using his entire backfield as more of a committee here is something that should give us some concern moving forward.
Yeah, and what about in Carolina? Are we seeing a committee? Because Mike Davis, we talked about last week how incredible his role was. I mean, and his role is still amazing, right? 21 touches, a lot of it coming through the passing game. But Reggie Bonifant came in and got 12 touches last week. That's something we could be concerned about, maybe more of a split. But also, you told me before the show that we were watching the game. Hashtag watching the game is always important. And Davis got banged up a little bit, so maybe that attributed to this.
Yeah, there was a point where he was on the sideline, and then you can actually just kind of search Mike Davis injury on Twitter or whatever. There were several people that were talking about how he was getting looked at on the sideline for a little bit of a stretch there against the Cardinals in Week 4. Bonifant still only played 27% of the snaps in Week 4 compared to 71% for Davis. So I do think that, especially the score that Bonifant got, was on the back of basically Davis being unable to re-enter the game while he was being examined by medical personnel. That was my read on the situation. And also, Bonifant has been, I think he's been placed on injured reserve. So if someone else is going to eat into Mike Davis's workload, it's not going to be him this week. So we're kind of still in that situation where Carolina's probably not ready to bring McCaffrey back, although it does sound like that's getting close. So I think we get at least one more week of the Mike Davis show here.
Right. Bonifant was placed on practice squad injured reserve, which I admittedly have no clue what that is compared to regular injured reserve. So we'll see. Either way, he's not going to be available this week. Mike Davis show rolls on. And then finally, San Francisco's backfield. Jerick McKinnon just out of nowhere dominates the opportunity in Week 4. Was important for the showdown slate. 92% of the snaps. Have you read anything to see why Jeff Wilson didn't play that much in the first half or at all, or why this split was as it was?
I have not seen anything on that, to be fully transparent with you, but obviously you know how much I love Jerick McKinnon. So the argument I can make to you is that they just finally decided to play their best player. I think there was concern that he would be needed to be eased into a larger workload. And I guess let's take seriously the concerns the 49ers had with the field in New York, right? When they played those back-to-back games there, obviously was not the case in Week 4 at home against the Eagles. So look, McKinnon is looking like the guy, one of the better value running backs now, at least here in Week 5, without Mostert and Coleman for at least one more week. So definitely should not ignore the fact that he just completely took over this backfield in Week 4. I think that is a sign of things to come for at least one more game.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking ahead now, Week 5, let's take a look at the high level. We always love to start from the top down, which teams are in good spots, and then we drill down to the player level. So the Week 5 betting market, some of the biggest spreads so far on the slate this week. The Chiefs are 13.5-point favorites over the Raiders if that game goes off. Ravens 13.5-point favorites over the Bengals. Dallas 9.5-point favorites over NFC East rival New York Giants. Rams 7.5-point favorites over the Washington football team. Arizona 7-point favorites over the Jets, and Pittsburgh a touchdown favorite over the Eagles. Quick thoughts, takeaways from some of these bigger spreads.
I think it's going to be super important to make sure that you have the right Chiefs in your lineups this week. That's my favorite spot so far, Brian. I don't know what your read is, but just looking at some of the advanced data here, Chiefs right now through Football Outsiders, I am addicted to that DVOA data. They have the Chiefs offensive line graded as the best pass blocking unit in the league. They have the Raiders pass defense graded as the 30th best pass defense in the league. They also have the Raiders rush defense graded as the 30th best rush defense in the league. So I think that means all of Patrick Mahomes, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Tyreek Hill, Sammy Watkins, Miko Hart, the whole team is in play. So I really do think the fact that they are such big favorites, we haven't gotten to this point yet, but they do also have the highest implied team total on this slate. I think we're going to need a piece of the Chiefs offense this week, and we're going to have to choose wisely there.
Dude, their team total is like 5 touchdowns, 35
Yeah.
points basically,
Yeah.
which is just insanity. And maybe something we'll start seeing more often now as less holding penalties are being called, more and more scoring is happening, more and more teams going for it on fourth down. Maybe we'll see some of these team totals creep into the mid 30s. So, what about Zeko Elliott? So 9.5 point favorites over the Giants, continues his strong workload. He looks like an incredible play and probably a great low risk play this week. Although, admittedly, I haven't looked at his salary yet.
He's the same price as he was last week, at least on DraftKings, 7,800 again. I think he's pretty much probably going to dominate ownership this week without Kamara on the main slate, since I believe the Saints play on Monday night.
Yep.
It's one of the primetime games. The thing with Elliott right now is the a number of targets. He's gotten 7+ targets in 3 straight weeks. I know a lot of that has been due to game script. I mean, they've been trailing every week by like multiple scores and charge back, in the fourth quarter to at least make these games interesting. Maybe against the Giants, this is finally the week where they actually play from ahead and he gets some more work on the ground and scores that way. But I mean, we've seen, and I feel like I already said this last week, but we've seen Elliott get the work in very negative game scripts for a running back. I have to feel like even if we get a positive game script, and Dallas being favored by almost 10 points certainly suggests that we will, that he'll be just as excellent to use as he has been. So I think he's probably going to be one of the biggest spots this week to be on, in addition to the Chiefs that obviously we talked about. And then someone I don't think we've really talked about much this year, Brian, but James Conner. I mean, with Pittsburgh 7-point favorites at home against the Eagles, looks like he's kind of back to full health. He's probably someone we're going to want to look at here as well.
Yeah, I think so too. And what's crazy to me, honestly, just looking at some of this, is that the Houston and Jacksonville game, this total is
Yep.
now without Bill O'Brien, 54.5 points, second highest total on the slate. So we'll get to game stacks a little bit later, but we'll probably want a piece of some action here too. And I don't know if it's James Robinson or Deshaun or some of that passing game, but just a lot of points to go around here.
For sure. And I think speaking of that, there we may have some intriguing wide receivers to talk about from not just that game, but a couple others as well. So, yeah. So why don't we just kind of get right into that, Brian? I mean, I know you were looking at some of the underperforming wide receivers last week. I think some of our favorite ones helped us out. Some didn't. Um,
That's the
what's
nature
the
of the
read on
game.
it this?
That's the
Yeah.
nature of the game.
What's the read on it this week here? Who are we looking at?
Uh,
And we can just skip over AJ Green because he's definitely still on this list.
He's forever going to be on this list. Is now the AJ Green underperforming Memorial receiver list.
Yes.
But we have Calvin Ridley. Now without Julio Jones, this is again one of those perfect blow up spots where we get an underperformer and a teammate missing to boost volume. That's Calvin
Mm-hmm.
Ridley. Marquise Brown is on the list this week. He was expected to score 20, 25 fantasy points last week and was missed on a couple of deep balls. They play in a high total game this week. Your boy, Darius Slayton, in a pace up game against the Cowboys, is an underperforming receiver. We could probably skip over Chris Hogan as well. He's on this list. The most intriguing name, and you probably have PTSD if you've played DFS through the first 4 weeks, of Logan Thomas, who has scored a combined like 5 points all year. But he's been expected to score 25, 30 fantasy points. The rare underperforming tight end has made the list. When these tight ends make this list, historically they do very well. And now he actually gets a quarterback change. So this may be the boost we need to see Logan Thomas realize his expected fantasy points.
Week 4 was his worst game of the season. Only had 4 targets. He's had at least 7 in every other game and only had 1 reception for 8 yards. But you knew that if you played him. That's why I know it. I think with Kyle Allen under center, we probably should expect a little bit more out of Thomas here. And yeah, you already made this point. It's really difficult the way that we do the kind of the formula here for a tight end to creep onto the list here. And Thomas has found his way there. Washington is very, very banged up at the skill positions. I mean, even Terry, I think, flashed on the injury report last week before playing. So Thomas is firmly in like the top 2 or 3 for them as far as options in the offense go. It's pretty much Terry, Antonio Gibson, and Logan Thomas. Those are their best players to use. So I really think we have to look at him here. Brian, my favorite opportunity here on this list. And I know, speaking of kind of the other PTSD option here, we kind of joked about it at the top of this section, but we love when we can game stack with underperforming wide receivers. And this week, it is the Ravens and the Bengals that are on this list. It is Marquise Brown and AJ Green. I think we can pretty easily get to them in our lineups if we have the stones to do it. I don't know if that'll be one of the games that we're featuring in the plug yet. I'm kind of leaning against it, but when we have these opportunities presented to us by the list, it is worth at least discussing.
Yeah, and even if you don't fully stack that game, right? You're playing tournament lineups. You could easily, in two of your receiver spots or one of your flex spots, just play AJ Green and Marquise Brown together, and that's correlation and it's high upside. Now I know no one wants to play AJ Green at this point, but there's a reason he's going to be super low owned, and his price is where it is. His price has dropped dramatically. I've made this case over the last week and a half, 2 weeks. NFL teams throw the ball to their talented players. Until AJ Green stops getting the ball thrown to him, that's when we can stop playing them. NFL teams, they're not going to throw the ball to players who aren't open, who they don't think deserve the targets. This is the highest league in football. And so targets equals talent equals opportunity. AJ Green is still getting on the field and he's still getting the ball. And it's going to take a lot of stones to play him this week. But Chris, at his price, at his lowered ownership, it's got to be someone you consider in tournaments.
I mean, he's 4,800 now on DraftKings. I mean, they're really just at this point daring us to get exposure to him, and I know that we're suckers for it. But this is an important point, right? And I know it's one that you preach all the time. I mean, with our especially tournament lineups, especially, it's not how often we beat the cash line, right? It's how do we build lineups that can get us to the top of the table, and you know better than anyone having this conversation right now. Focusing on the names on this list and getting some decent exposure to them in your tournament lineups is a really great way to do that.
Absolutely. The final guy we didn't talk about, but you did hint at, Brandon Cooks. Burned a lot of people in cash lineups last week, apparently, but he's on the list. He's underperforming in a high game total, so go play him. And then if you somehow listen to this before the Thursday night game kicks off, Darnell Mooney and Anthony Miller are underperforming receivers, so consider them in your captain spot on DraftKings for tournaments for Thursday night. All right, we talked about Logan Thomas. Let's head over to the weekly Logan Thomas segment called the Tight Ends Route Run Leaders for Week 4. So obviously Thomas was up there 85% of the routes. Any other tight ends stick out last week from a route ran percentage standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, Evan Engram playing virtually all the snaps for the Giants, at least in the passing game, had 9 targets in that game last week. So I think now that they're facing the Dallas Cowboys, and at this point everybody knows that the path to winning $1 million is just stacking the Dallas Cowboys game, I think Evan Engram is probably going to be someone a lot of people use as a value tight end. And then the other side of that game would be Dalton Schultz. 8 targets for him, ran 44 routes, good for about 72% of the dropbacks from Dak Prescott against the Browns. So each of those guys, I think, are worth considering in some tournament builds this week. We're going to see a lot of people just pay up at tight end, I think. Travis Kelce, George Kittle, Darren Waller, these guys are all on the Mark Andrews. They're all on the slate this week. So some of these kind of bottom of the barrel, kind of gross tight ends, to be honest with you, are probably not going to be as viable as they have been over the last few weeks.
Which means we are definitely playing them in tournaments and getting a different looking lineup than the rest of the field. So you talked about stacking Dallas and winning $1 million every week. That seems to be the case. So Dallas and Giants on the table this week for our final segment. Game stacks to look at least here on Wednesday. Chris, you're going to finalize the games to actually target in the Friday daily plug. Chris is now 4 for 4 in calling game stacks that win $1 million. So no pressure, Chris. You got to keep this up the rest of the year. Who are the ones you're looking at in week 5?
Again, as long as I keep Dallas on the list, it feels like I'm going to be right.
True.
So, I do like the Houston Texans and the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. Jaguars got DJ Chark back, and he immediately has a big game for them on Sunday against the Bengals. And on the Houston side, I mean, we know who Will Fuller is. He almost had 2 touchdowns last week, so you can argue he might actually still be kind of underperforming a little bit, but there's a little bit of a sign of what his true ceiling is at the end of that game there for Houston against the Vikings. And then, Brandon Cooks on the underperforming wide receiver list, still running some very high value routes that we like for tournaments. David Johnson, Duke Johnson, both are viable, I think, in tournament environments. And, we haven't really had that unbelievable game from Deshaun Watson yet that I think we know he's capable of. And he's much cheaper than all the other quote unquote stud quarterbacks this week. So, and I'm not even trying to ignore Gardner Minshew here, but I do think that, people are probably a little more interested in Watson in these game stacks. But either way, I do think there's some options there for us to look at, certainly with the high total. Already kind of talked a little bit about how all of the Chiefs are in play due to the implied team total, due to the matchups. I mean, these guys are all kind of matchup proof for us anyway, right? So the fact that they get such a tasty matchup against the Raiders this week puts them on our radar. And then obviously on the Raiders side, I mean, we've got Josh Jacobs, we've got Darren Waller. Have to keep an eye on those receivers because I know they've been banged up over the last few weeks, and somebody like Nelson Aguilar has been playing a ton for them. And well, that's pretty gross. I mean, it does make it easy for us to stack that game because I think some of the options on the Raiders side are actually a little affordable. And then my own personal addiction, I guess our addiction, considering some of the teams that we've built together and shown each other all year, really. Carolina Panthers. Can't quit Teddy Bridgewater, right? Teddy Bridgewater, Mike Davis, DJ Moore is super well, he's not on our list anymore, but I think he is still underperforming a little bit. Robbie Anderson, those are all quality options on the Carolina side, Brian. And then these Falcons. I do think that game is a sneaky one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just do want to make one quick point before we get out of here. You talk about Kansas City and the Raiders. If that game goes off, we had some questions on our Tuesday night stream, which you can always check the replay on YouTube, where we review previous week's 150 max lineup strategy, high level DFS strategy. And we did get a question about stacking games and running them back with one player from the other side. And in the case of Las Vegas, right, you don't have to get too cute, right? Just literally Josh Jacobs or Darren Waller. If you stack the Chiefs with 3 players, just running back with one of those 2 players on the Raiders, and you're fine. You don't have to get cute and try to play Aguilar or Renfro. Just play the guys who are going to get a ton of volume, and you're probably fine.
Yeah, I mean, that's what kind of happened with the Dallas Cleveland game last week, right? I mean, we pretty much advocated for run the Dallas guys and just use Beckham. And honestly, that's what played out. Could have the same thing happen as well this week. You just highlighted it with that game. But with the Giants, just use Darius Slayton or Evan Engram. He's, running a ton of routes. So I think a lot of people feel like in these game stack environment, Brian, that they need to use the quote unquote worst team heavy to be different than the field. And I'm sure you covered this in your Tuesday show. We don't need to get that cute with it. I mean, not as many people as there should be are building highly correlated lineups this way. So you can still play the better teams as long as you're 3-1 game stacking.
Hit the nail on the head. All right, that'll do it for the Week 5 edition of the Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast. You can follow Chris on Twitter at CDR02989. You can follow me at Brian Jester FF. Follow us at Occupy Fantasy. Please go subscribe in your favorite podcast app or here on YouTube if you're watching the video. That way you always get the latest episode of our Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast. So for Chris, I'm Brian. Appreciate you all listening. Good luck this week. And we'll talk to you next week.